It sounds like your point with relocation, or one of your points with relocation is since people are relocating, that sets up potential for further conflict. Because if you're talking about a very mixed and diverse, I live in California and you have opinions of all kinds all over the place, depending on where you live in California, that's one thing. But if everybody who lives in a large swathe of California all has one opinion and and I put everybody, let's say 90% of Texas has another opinion, it's much easier to have a real conflict when you have that kind of like a lack
Exactly.
of,
There's, I
yeah.
think what you're touching on, and I explain it in the books, is this hollowing out process.
Yes.
What happens is because of going to the affinity group or that place, which tends to have people more like that, then, for example, the richer people move to places that more richer people are in and tend to protect wealth more. And as a result of that, the tax base moves. And as a result of the tax base moves, there's becomes a hollowing out that produces a dynamic. It's more difficult to have public services. The circumstances get worse, and then that produces its own dynamic that makes that conflict worse, and that becomes a less hospitable place to be, which creates a force to move, which reinforces that cycle. That's right. That's how it works. That's how it works mechanistically.
Right. No, that makes sense. Because if let's say I'm doing pretty well, I live in Michigan or whatever, where I grew up, and I realize, hey, I'm so sick of paying high taxes. I'm going to vote for somebody in office that doesn't do that. And now we have bad roads, bad schools, bad policing, like Detroit did or does. And then everybody who has money says, I'm going to move to Bloomfield Hills or a suburb or just an enclave that's nicer, but we don't have enough cops. Let's just do a private security force for our area. And you know what? We're going to redo the roads. It'll be private. We're going to buy this up and take it out of city hands. And my kids are all going to go to private schools because if you've seen the public schools, they're terrible. You can't even go there. They have metal detectors. People are getting stabbed. So then the people who can't afford to live in that enclave live in the equivalent of Baghdad or Fallujah or whatever. I mean, it's a hyperbole, but they live in a place where the schools are bad, the roads are bad, and there's no cops.
And it's not very much hyperbole. I've described Connecticut. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, and the public school system spends about $24,000 per student per year. Right up the road are towns like Bridgeport, Connecticut, in which they spend something like $14,000 a year per school. And if you drive around the neighborhood, it does look as you're describing, and there's poverty. They need more remediation than they need more money, not less
Hmm.
money, because they have an environment and a set of circumstances where there's poverty, not just schools. So it's like you're describing, right? There's a certain amount of hyperbole, but not much hyperbole in a lot of places.
The place where my dad grew up, I believe there's no trash pickup. It'll take the cops something like days to get to you. I mean, literally, they're not starting to drive there as soon as you call it in. They just might not show up at all. And it might be an hour because there's like 28 square miles or something that they have to cover and 80 cop cars, something along those lines. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And the power system is damaged in a lot of areas. There are entire blocks where one house has two old people in it or an old person in it or two houses do, and every other house is abandoned. So they don't service that place with things like sanitation or fresh roads or pretty much anything.
And
They're on their own.
people don't understand that because a lot of people live, they're in Greenwich, Connecticut. How much time do they go 15 minutes up the road and go to Bridgeport, Connecticut? My wife, the state capital of Connecticut is Hartford, Connecticut, used to be the insurance capital of the world. And it's now, it has that type of thing. And my wife is working to, try to help that population. She's with the mayor, and they're in this control room kind of thing where they have the cameras on different places. And there are kids who have a problem walking to school because they have to pass through areas where there are gangs that have gang shootings. And she asks the mayor, well, why can't you have the police assure safe passage? Said there are 275 police. That's all we can afford because there's police or this thing and that. And it's just what you're describing. So there is how does this take place? It's a reality. It's a reality. Not everywhere, but if people need to get around and look at these things or look at the statistics.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that, look, the biggest challenge for leaders is to develop a capitalist system that is both good at growing the pie and limiting inequalities within the system. So the wealth gap was something we talked about earlier. Education was something we talked about earlier. Things like healthcare probably, I would imagine, at least now, certainly comes to mind. I probably wasn't even thinking about it 2 years ago or 5 years ago, but certainly now.
Well, what you see over and over again, which is common throughout history, this is almost a universal truth, that drawing from the largest population to give opportunity to is both functionally great. You will get the best talent if you can draw from the largest population, and it also makes it sense of fair inequality to produce equality, which then makes the system stable. Okay, and you could see this. This goes back to in all societies. If you go back to China and the meritocracy, some would say began with Confucius and meritocracy and exams and how they did it. And you could see it in different cultures, that one thing, like you have to create that, and together to create productivity that raises living standards and so on. And then, of course, with consideration in terms of helping those who can't help themselves. But by and large, that's been a tried and true thing through that whole period of time, because you have to make things better and you've got to pay for them too. And so, to the extent that each individual is as self sufficient as possible, and you enable them that they can pay for it and they can contribute the most, that's never perfect and so on. But that notion is basically universally and timelessly ingredients for a successful society and a fair society.
So, and first of all, I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think a lot about the investment in infrastructure, education. You obviously do as well. You mentioned your wife is working in that probably full time, trying to figure out how to help some of these populations that don't have access to resources. We know what happens when these are neglected. If you don't know and you're still not getting it, take a stopover in Detroit and drive around for a few hours, and you'll see what that might look like when taken to some of the extremes. What do you think of programs like, and I'm trying not to be partisan here, but just because it's top of mind, what do you think of something like Build Back Better essentially stalling in Congress? I mean, we don't have to get into the nitpicky details of that particular plan, but do you think we need something that is a bold move that says, hey, look, broadband, healthcare, resources, mental health facilities, whatever else? Do you think we need a bold step, or do we need very small measured steps
Yes,
instead?
yes, I think that I think we need a bold step, and simultaneously, those are in many cases great investments if done well to pay for themselves through their productivity. Right, like we encountered, as I say, but through experiences. So our experiences are sort of the teachers. That when COVID came along, kids didn't have this population didn't have computers and didn't have connectivity. That's like not having water or not having electricity. Okay. Yeah, like it's basic. And so when you look at some of these things, that kind of infrastructure in terms of those basics is a great return on investment, as well as something that makes the system fair. And there are a lot of those, right? So you have to be conscious about those types of things, right? But do you get to pay for it, and how does that work? Because there's a financial part of this that has to also work, right? Because when you create a debt and you're selling the debt, there are buyers of that debt. So there's a supply demand. And if they don't buy that debt, then you have a problem that you have to print a lot of money and then you produce an inflation. And so how you balance those things requires both a skill level and a sense of what the objective is, right? In other words, you have to have the skill to know how to balance those things. That's an economic financial skill. How do you produce those things? And then how do you sell the bonds to balance those things? And then you have to have the goal in mind. And that goal has to be really that kind of equal opportunity and drawing. So you're being both productive and also creating prosperity that the majority of people benefit from.